A drum roll through the silence. He stopped in the center of the cafe, glancing once at Lena, who swallowed hard, then at Ray, who had slowly stood up. Their eyes met. Ray nodded quietly. The colonel returned it with something even deeper. A salute, and that's when Prescott stammered. I didn't know. He was the colonel. Didn't raise his voice. You don't need to know who someone is to treat them with basic dignity. He turned to Lena. Is Grace Donnelly here? Lena shook her head. She was fired for standing up for Mr. McMillan and Shadow. Colonel Gaines turned his jaw, tightening. That woman once served the families of this base better than most agencies combined. She gave my men a place to breathe when they came home with no words, and she treated a decorated Marine with the respect this nation promised him, and forgot. Ray cleared his throat, speaking for the first time. She didn't ask questions, he said quietly. She didn't flinch when I walked in with a dog. She just poured the coffee and gave me a place to sit. That was the first time in a long time I felt like a person again. A tear slipped down a woman's cheek near the register. Colonel Gaines nodded, then turned to the Marines waiting outside. He stepped toward the door, and with a simple motion, he raised his hand in signal they filed. An orderly, silent, reverent. 2 Marines moved behind the counter and removed the corporate logo from the wall, folding the vinyl panel like a flag. Another replaced the chalkboard sign with a new one brought from their vehicle. It read in bold white hand-painted letters, "Welcome to Grace's house where honor is served daily." When Deborah Lyle tried to interject, Colonel Gaines looked at her only once. "You've made your decision," he said. "Now we'll make ours." Then he stepped outside, phone in hand. A moment later, Lena's phone buzzed. She looked down, confused. "It's a direct message from Fort Granger," she said. "They've requested Grace report to base headquarters today." Ray let out a slow breath, eyes wide. Shadow stood in the cafe that once held coffee and comfort. Something entirely new was brewing, a reckoning. Grace sat in her truck on the edge of her driveway, keys in hand but engine off. She'd been sitting there for 15 minutes, still in her cafe clothes, coffee-stained jeans, her favorite blue flannel, and shoes that had seen more spilled espresso than she cared to count. Grace stared out at the road, replaying the morning over and over again. Fired in front of customers for doing the right thing, and now a message from the base. Colonel Gaines would like to meet at Fort Granger headquarters today. She didn't know what that meant. She didn't know if it was a good thing, but somehow deep down she felt the shift. Something larger than her life at the Mason Mug had just begun. Grace took a breath, turned the ignition, and headed down the familiar road. She'd driven hundreds of times before. Only this time she wasn't going to drop off muffins or coffee canisters. This time she was going through the gates. Fort Granger stood like a city of disciplined, orderly roads, flag-lined avenues, the sound of cadence calls echoing in the background. Grace had been there as a military wife before, but now, walking into the main administration building, she felt like an outsider again. Colonel Richard Gaines met her at the door. He wasn't in dress blues now, just a clean khaki uniform, and a calm presence that could command a room with a glance. "Grace," he said, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming." She shook it, firm but unsure, still not entirely sure why I'm here. "Let me show you something." He led her down a hallway lined with portraits of past commanders, training maps, and commendation plaques. They stopped in front of a door labeled Veteran Transition and Wellness Initiative. Inside the room was filled with folding chiefs, chairs, whiteboards, and boxes of unused supplies. A few young staffers moved quietly in the corner, setting up therapy mats and moving donated equipment. "This is a pilot program," he explained. "We've been trying to get it off the ground for 2 years. Trouble is, it's hard to find someone who understands vets, not just from paperwork, but from the inside." Grace folded her arms. "I'm not a therapist. I don't have a degree in social work." "No," he said, "but you built a place where men and women with invisible wounds came to heal. You did more with coffee and kindness than some programs do with $1 million budget." She didn't answer right away. Colonel Gaines stepped closer, his tone softening. "You created a sanctuary without realizing it. What you did in that cafe, that was leadership, that was service." Then from the back room, a voice called out, "Is that her?" A young woman stepped out, mid-20s, long sleeves covering burn scars along her arms and jaw. Her name tag read Tiffany Rios. She walked slowly, a golden retriever puppy beside her wearing a red vest marked in training. "Hi," she said shyly. "I just wanted to say I saw the video of you and the dog and the guy. I haven't been to a coffee shop since I came home, but I think I could sit in a place you run." Grace blinked. The air in her chest shifted. Colonel Gaines smiled. "We'd like to offer you a position, not as a figurehead, not as a name on a brochure, but as the director of this center." Grace exhaled. "You're serious as a heart attack," he said. "You'd run the programs, build the space, shape the culture. You already know what works: community routine, respect." She looked at Tiffany, now kneeling with her dog. She thought of Ray, of Shadow, of the dozens of men and women who'd found their way into the Mason mug. Not for lattes, but for peace. And suddenly she knew. "I'll do it," she said quietly. The colonel nodded once. "Then let's get to work." That night, Grace stood alone in what would soon be the new heart of Fort. Rearseer's outreach efforts, the walls were bare. The floors still scuffed, but the air felt full of something sacred. She reached into her bag and took out an old photo. Michael, her husband, sitting outside the cafe, his boots up, smiling at her. She pinned it to the wall. No plaque, no frame, just memory and mission. Word spread faster than she imagined. By the end of the week, the Veteran Transition and Wellness Center at Fort Granger wasn't just another military initiative. It had become something alive. Veterans who hadn't stepped foot on base in years showed up. Young soldiers returned with hesitant spouses. Even the local newspaper, the Mason Herald, ran a full-page spread. From café to command, how Grace Donnelly is rebuilding trust, one cup at a time. Grace didn't do anything flashy. She didn't bring in fancy speakers or consultants. She just did what she'd always done. She paid attention. She asked names and remembered them. She posted a whiteboard near the coffee pot that read, "Who needs a ride? Who needs a listener?" She let dogs curl up in corners of therapy rooms without a fuss. She kept that same handwritten notebook from the cafe and added new pages, one for every vet who walked through the door. Some days were quiet, some were hard, some were full of nothing but silence and refills, but something powerful was building. A space where pain wasn't hidden and healing didn't need to be loud. Ray came often now. Shadow would walk straight to his favorite corner and lie down, like he'd always belonged. Tiffany Rios showed up every Tuesday. She wasn't ready to speak in groups yet, but she'd begun sketching again, images of dogs, hands, and homecomings. And Lena, the young barista from the Mason mug, visited every Friday. She brought coffee, yes, but also laughter. And when Grace needed a second opinion on anything, from wallpaper to website wording, Lena was the first to weigh in. But not everyone was thrilled. Some officials questioned why someone with no formal training was running a federal pilot program. Auditors arrived, quietly, clipboards in hand, suits stiff with skepticism. They examined logs, asked probing questions, even tested the water filters on the coffee machine. At the end of their review, one inspector looked Grace dead in the eye and asked, "What certifications do you hold that qualify you to counsel veterans?" Grace didn't blink. "I don't have certifications," she said softly, "just consistency and kindness." The inspector didn't respond, but he took notes. A week later, Grace received a formal notice. The Wellness Center was being reviewed for possible national model expansion. Colonel Gaines called it a victory. Grace just called it humbling. But even as the center grew, the Mason mug still tugged at her heart. One afternoon, she returned quietly, without announcement. Lena was behind the counter. "You're supposed to be famous now," she teased, sliding a mug across the counter. "I'm just here for coffee," Grace said, smiling. The cafe had changed. Photos of vets now lined the walls. Ray, Tiffany, and others. A new sign had been hung near the register. Grace's Corner, where no one sits alone. Later that day, Grace drove across town to speak at a local fundraiser for veteran families. It was a modest event, mostly older folks and kids with crayon posters. She spoke without notes. "I didn't set out to build a program," she said. "I just refused to throw out a man and his dog." The crowd fell silent. Then applause, loud, long, real, and somewhere in the back, Rye stood, his silver star pinned to his chest, and gave her a quiet salute back at the center. That night, Grace sat alone by the wall of photos. She added one more, a picture of the cafe taken the day after the Humvees came. People standing shoulder to shoulder, dogs lying under tables, coffee in every hand, no fear, no shame, just connection. Above it, she taped a small card that read, "Legacy isn't what we build for ourselves, it's what we protect in others." And in that stillness, Grace understood the cafe hadn't closed. It had simply moved. 3 weeks after the fundraiser, a letter arrived. It came in a sealed envelope stamped with the gold emblem of the Department of Defense. Colonel Gaines handed it to Grace, personally. They stood inside her office at the Wellness Center, surrounded by the quiet hum of a space, still learning how to heal. He didn't say much, just, "You'll want to sit for this." She opened it slowly. The official language blurred as her eyes scanned the first line. "You are hereby nominated for the National Civilian Commendation for Distinguished Service to Veterans." She read it again, then again. "I didn't do anything special," she whispered. Colonel Gaines chuckled. "That's exactly why you're getting it." The letter came with an invitation, not just to attend a ceremony in Washington, but to speak at the National Veterans Advocacy Conference. Grace felt her knees go weak. "I'm not a public speaker." "You are." Now, the day she left for D.C., she packed light. Just one blazer, an old watch of Michael's, and the same notebook she'd used behind the cafe counter for years. Names, birthdays, knows like Tiffany, prefers tea, and don't ask Rye about May 15th. That notebook had carried more weight than any resume. As she waited at the airport, she heard someone call her name. "Need a ride? Miss Donnelly?" She turned to see Ray McMillan, standing tall, in full dress blues, shadow calmed by his side, tail gently wagging. "The base assigned me as your escort," he said with a grin. Grace laughed, half nerves, half awe. "You clean up pretty good," he smirked. "You're the one about to speak to the Pentagon." The ballroom at the conference was larger than she expected. White tablecloths, polished brass podium, cameras at every angle. Her name glowed on the screen behind her, in elegant lettering. When she stepped up to the microphone, her voice was smaller than the room, but the room leaned in. "I'm not a general, I'm not a doctor, I didn't write policy, I managed a cafe near a military base. I served coffee, I listened." A pause, but in that space I watched something sacred happen. Veterans came not for advice, but for presence. They didn't need to be fixed, they needed to be seen. People nodded, a few wiped away tears. One day, I got fired for letting a man sit with his service dog. That was the moment everything changed. But the truth is, it was never about coffee. It was about dignity. Applause thundered through the hall. Ray stood in the back. He didn't cheer, he didn't clap. He just nodded like a soldier, hearing his orders. Finally, clearly. Later that night, as the sun dipped behind the PTO ache, Grace stepped outside alone. She needed airspace, silence. A man in a gray suit with a white beard approached, quiet, kind eyes behind thin glasses. "You don't remember me, do you?" he asked. She studied his face. It stirred something. He pulled out an old photograph, grainy, faded. Her, Michael, and the older man in uniform outside the cafe, long before her husband's last deployment. "You poured me a cup of coffee the day I got my medical discharge. You didn't say anything, you just smiled. It was the first time I felt like myself again." He held out the photo. "It's yours now." She took it with trembling fingers. Words caught in her throat. Back home in Mason, the town held a welcome celebration. But Grace didn't go straight there. She returned to the Wellness Center. It was late, quiet. A few veterans still lingered near the fire pit. She walked to the wall of photos, reached into her bag and added one more, a snapshot of the conference crowd giving her a standing ovation. Beside it, she taped the old cafe photo, the one with Michael and the soldier from long ago, and below them she wrote a simple line, "Honor grows where kindness is consistent." As she turned to leave, young veteran with nervous eyes stepped through the door. "Is this the place for, people like us?" Grace smiled gently. "No, son, this is the place for people like all of us." And just like that, her circle wasn't just full, it was open in a world that moves faster every day. It's easy to overlook the quiet moments, the soft-spoken waitress, the trembling veteran, the wag of a service dog's tail. But sometimes those moments are the ones that shape us. Grace Donnelly didn't wear a uniform, she didn't hold rank, but she upheld something sacred, dignity, and in doing so she reminded us all that honor isn't earned once it's defended. Daily, what happened at that small cafe in Mason, Georgia, may seem like a rare story, but maybe it shouldn't be. How many Graces have we walked past without noticing? How many veterans have we thanked only with words, not actions? In today's divided world, Grace's story asks us to pause, to ask ourselves, would I have stood up like she did? Have I ever kept quiet when I should have spoken up? We want to hear from you. Have you ever witnessed a quiet act of courage in your own life? Or maybe you've been on the receiving end of someone else's grace. Share your story in the comments below. Your experience could inspire someone else to do the right thing, even when it's hard. Thank you for spending time with us today. If this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes in quiet heroes. At this channel, we tell stories that matter, stories that honor not just the uniform, but the humanity behind it. Because sometimes the strongest stand doesn't come with a salute.